Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I'm discussing Edd, and Eddy, created by Danny Antonucci. The series premiered on Cartoon Network on January 4th, 1999. It ran for 6 seasons with a total of 70 episodes, 131 segments, and the series finale, Edd, and Eddy's Big Picture Show, aired on November 8th, 2009. So a solid 10-year run for this show. And I absolutely love this cartoon. It's so hilarious, my goodness. One of those cartoons, again, where I loved it so much as a kid, and I love it equally as an adult. One of those shows that made me laugh when I was really young watching it, and now. And it's just, oh my goodness, it's an excellent show. And it is one of those shows that I appreciate things about the characters and the writing more so now. And first off, gotta talk the theme song. And the series composer, who also composed the theme song, is Patrick Caird. And a fun fact about the theme song, which I actually mentioned when I shared my top 10 favorite theme songs, because this was on the list, is that the whistling in the theme song is done by the series creator, Danny Antonucci. And it's just such a fun theme song. One of those theme songs that just gets you pumped to watch the show. It's so catchy and jazzy, and with the whistling, and how you see the three Eds and just their distinct personalities. Eddy showing off for the camera, Double Dee backing away, like shy, and Edd, dopey as ever, just waving. And then when they keep moving the camera, and when they crash into the screen, it's just great. I love the theme song. Love that whistling. It's just so much fun. Let's see if I can do it. I can't. I mean, I can whistle, but not as sharply as Danny Antonucci. It's a great theme song. And I haven't done this in a while when I discussed a show, but this is the perfect show to do it. Let's break down the characters. We got Edd with 1D, voiced by Matt Hill, and just that lovable oaf. Not quite bright, but very strong. Always happy and just very much in his own little world. And then we got Edd with 2Ds, better known as Double Dee, who is my favorite character. And he's voiced by Samuel Vincent. And he's very intelligent. And of course, he's got the classic ski hat, but Eddy calls him Sockhead. Very smart, very clean, very neat. And then you got Eddy, voiced by Tony Sampson. And Eddy is one of those characters where I didn't really like him when I was a kid. I found him loud and obnoxious, but now, watching this show as an adult, there's more nuance to him. I really appreciate his character a lot more now, but he is the loudmouth, he is the leader of the group, he is the mastermind behind all of their classic scams to get those jawbreakers. And then we have Edd's little sister, Sarah, who I didn't care for her at all much either. Just very much a loudmouth, too. Always angry. And does not like her older brother. But Edd, it's sweet how he's protective of her. But, of course, it's just because he doesn't want to get in trouble with their mom. But and then her best friend, Jimmy. Very soft-spoken. He's got the retainer. And Sarah is voiced by Janice Jowd. And Jimmy is voiced by Keenan Christensen. And then there's Naz, the Valley girl, the girl that everyone has a crush on, pretty much. Very nice and friendly. She's voiced by Erin Fitzgerald. She actually had a few voice actresses, but that was the main one, Erin Fitzgerald. And then there's Kevin, who I never cared for him really at all either, even now. Just kind of the jock, and very much disliking the Eds, always calling them dorks. And then I do love Rolf. He's great. Voiced by Peter Kalamis. And Kevin, by the way, is voiced by, I never knew this until recently, he's voiced by a woman, Kathleen Barr, which is not out of the norm in voice acting to have women voice boys, but that was surprising to me learning that. But anyway, Rolf, the obscure European son of a shepherd, as he calls himself, I love Rolf, he's hilarious. The fact that he refers to himself in third person, and he calls the Eds Ed boys. And then I love also Johnny, played by David Paul Grove. He's an oddball character too, but you gotta love Plank. Plank is such an interesting character. The fact that it's just a board of wood, and yet it seems like it's alive because Johnny's imagination is what brings him to life. And then, of course, there's the Canker sisters. You got May, the blonde one, who likes Ed. You got Marie, the blue-haired one, who likes Double Dee. And you got Lee, the redhead, who likes Eddy. And Lee and Sarah have the same voice actress, Janice Jowd. And May and Naz, also voiced by Erin Fitzgerald. And then Marie is voiced by the same woman who voices Kevin, Kathleen Barr. So that's interesting to me, too. And I never cared for the Canker sisters. They're just always, obviously, they're antagonists of the show, preying on the Eds. Just, my goodness. And they're the only characters that don't live in the cul-de-sac. And that's a really cool feature of this show, too. The fact that all these kids living in this cul-de-sac, and it's perpetually summer, and the Eds always wanting to scam the kids so they can get quarters to buy those jawbreakers. And I remember as a kid being like, oh, jawbreakers must be so good, and then trying a jawbreaker and just being like, what's so great about this candy? I guess that's the point of it, though, the fact that in the show especially, it's just so comically big, the jawbreakers. I remember that when I was a kid, I really liked, because they're similar, I liked peppermints, like the round peppermints. My grandma always had those, so that's cute. And I actually also really liked fireballs, much smaller than jawbreakers, but I liked that they were hot at first and they would get sweet. Those are really good. So Danny Antonucci, the creator of the show, has said that he picked jawbreakers purposely for the show because they were such a horrific candy. And he said that it was one of those candies where you couldn't finish it, like you would have to just put it away then in a paper towel, then eat some more of it later because it was just so big. And another interesting thing about the show is the actual look of it with the what Danny Antonucci calls boiling lines, with the lines that move, the outlines for the characters. And he said you get those lines by tracing the same drawing over 3 times. So that's interesting. And he did that because he wanted it to stand out from other cartoons. And it really does obviously stand out, the look of it. And he said that just makes it look more alive. And this show, actually, he said that he created this show on a dare. Someone dared him to create a kids show. And then he drew these characters, the Eds, and then he just started thinking of ideas for them. And he has said that each of the Eds is a version of his personality, a more exaggerated version of his personality, which is common for writers in general, putting ourselves into the characters, obviously taking from your own lives, and in this case, their childhoods. So with the Eds, Danny Antonucci has said that Ed is basically him when he was younger, that he was very much in his own little world, and Double Dee is like him because he was always very meticulous and organized, and Eddy because he was a loudmouth kind of troublemaker as a kid. And another cool thing about this show was that he said the inspiration for all the multicolored tongues for the characters, which I remember as a kid thinking, that's so weird, how come they have green tongues and stuff? So I learned this years later. Danny Antonucci has said that the reason for that was because when he was doing a board for the show, I guess planning out the show, and then at one point when his son and his son's friends came in and they were all talking excitedly, and he noticed that they all had different colored tongues after just eating candy. So he put that into the show because that's very true to childhood too, that your tongue turns green or blue, whatever color, bright red whenever you eat candy. So that's a cute little feature too. So with the first episode, the Ed Touchables, and the intro with that episode, the first character we meet is Double Dee, and he's just excitedly using his label maker. I love Double Dee, oh my gosh. So Double Dee with his label maker, labeling everything in his room. And what's interesting is with that first episode, and really the first few episodes of the show, but that first one especially, that he has a more timid sounding voice, shyer. He kind of mumbles, like he's unsure of his words, just kind of sounds more nasally a little bit. Then his voice got clearer and more sure of himself, and he became more of kind of the stickler, really. But that's interesting too. Even Ed in that first episode, he kind of sounds more like a bro. That's my interpretation of it. Where it's like, hey, Eddy, what's up? It's interesting. That's what I really love about this show. that it's so character driven that we only have these 12 characters, 12 speaking characters, and then 13 if you include Plank, which, yes, you gotta include Plank. And then, of course, there's Rolf's animals. He's got Wilfred the pig and Victor the goat. He's got his farm animals. But the fact that this show was able to sustain with just these characters and that all the stories are so character driven, that's something I really love about this show. And then in the second episode, the second segment of episode 1, Nagged to Ed, where we meet the Cankers for the first time and they live in the trailer park. And it's also actually the first mention of Eddy's brother. He mentions his older brother, like he sent me a postcard here once or whatever he said. It looks like a postcard my brother sent me once. And then just as the first season progressed, we just get more character traits about all the characters, but the Eds in particular, obviously. Like in the episode Over Your Ed, where Double Dee and Eddy help Ed with his bad personal hygiene. Or the episode A Pinch to Grow in Ed, where Eddy is teased for being short, so then Double Dee creates those elevator boots for him. Or Tag Your Ed, where Double Dee is made fun of for being weak, and then Eddy's like, we just gotta work on your confidence, Double Dee. So then they do wrestling and he becomes the masked mumbler. It really is just such a cool concept for a show. 3 best friends with the same name. And Double Dee, obviously, because he's got 2 Ds instead of 1 D. And Eddy only calls Double Dee Ed in that first episode. I guess it's just to establish that his name is Ed too, like just to let the audience know. But it's so bizarre, that just never comes up again. He's just firmly Double Dee. And Double Dee, by the way, it's actually spelled D-E-E, not Double D the letter, but Double D, I guess to really make it distinct. I don't know. But just a random fun fact for you. That's the official spelling of it. And another season 1 episode I love is It's Way Ed, when the Eds are trying to keep up with the latest fads, and then just the kids first on stilts, and then as soon as they do that, then they're on to the next fad, which is so true of fads in general. But then fads come around again. They go away, but then they come back. And then when they make their own fad with combining everything that they did with the mailbox and the choo-choo train, like all that stuff. But then when they're trying to do new things, and at one point Ed is just spinning the hangers around on his ears. That's what's good about this show too. All the slapstick humor of it. It's so hilarious. Oh my goodness. Besides the very sharp character-driven writing as well. And Danny Antonucci directed nearly every episode of this show, and of course was the head writer. And so he obviously had his vision from the start, and you can tell, and it's just such a great show to revisit, for sure. I would say definitely my favorite Cartoon Network show. And then I love moments where no matter how many times I've seen it, it makes me laugh every time. One of those moments is in the episode Laugh, Ed, Laugh, when all the kids have chicken pox, so then Eddy can't do his scam. And that reminds me, so when you watch a bunch of episodes, obviously you binge watch a bunch in a row, then with this show in particular, I noticed the structure of nearly every episode, where that it starts with basically a cold open of just something that they're doing, and then something happens that really goes into the plot of the rest of the episode. So in this one, for instance, it's the Eds doing an ice cream truck scam, and then Eddy's like, here, make the ice cream, and then so Double D's doing the cones, and he's like, 1 scoop, please. So then Ed is just dunking a baseball into the pink paint to make it look like strawberry ice cream, and then he just bites into it at one point, and Double D's like, what are you doing, Ed? And he's like, no, get your own. But so then from there, my point is with that, from there then they see that no kids are coming out because they're all quarantined. When they go to knock on Jimmy's door, they see that he's sick, and then Double D's like, it's an epidemic, so they all have chicken pox. So then the rest of the episode is just Eddy slowly but surely going insane because he can't scam the kids. That's what's so funny too, the fact that it's always a scam, like not a genuine thing, but a scam to get these kids to cough up their quarters. And that's what's funny too, that how come the Eds never ever had any cash on them, but all these other kids did? They got their allowance, I guess, but I digress. Anyway, so the moment I love in this episode was when Double D's like, we gotta do something to help Eddy, and then at one point, then he and Ed are each wearing a mask. Like Double Dee's wearing a plank mask, and Ed is wearing a Johnny mask. And then Eddy's like, oh, Johnny, hey, you want to come in? And then the mask falls off. The Johnny mask falls off of Ed's face. And then Eddy says, Johnny, you dropped your face. I'll get you a new one. That's just hilarious to me. Oh, gosh. And then it ends with them trapped in the shed because, like, oh, look, Eddy, you're rich. And they just had the drawn money. And then, of course, afterwards, then all the kids are healthy again. They're just out and about playing in the cul-de-sac. And then they're trapped in there because Double Dee told Ed to get rid of the key discreetly, so then he ate it, of course. That's what's interesting, too, that the Eds basically never, ever, ever get a win. It always ends with a loss for them. Just always them stuck together somehow or just in pain or whatever. Never get a win. I also love the episode, though, Who, What, Where, When... Whoa, that's not right. Who, What, Where, Ed. That's what's fun, too. All these episodes have just Ed in the title. Just like these phrases, common phrases with Ed in there. That's clever, too. But in that one, when Eddy's trying to make an omelet, and he's like, oh, bring me the eggs, to Ed, of course, and Ed puts his... First he looks in the freezer, and he sticks his tongue on a popsicle, then he's gets the eggs, and then he's trying to walk, and then his tongue gets stuck, so then all the eggs break. And then they want to trade Rolf an egg, but then he wants sawdust. And then it becomes this chain of trading people. Then they go to Kevin for the sawdust, but then he wants them to paint the shed. Then they go to Johnny, but he wants whatever he wants. Plums, I think. And they go to Johnny. It just keeps going and going with all the different characters, with them trading. So then at one point, then they have to go get clams, and then they're going house to house. And this moment always makes me laugh no matter how many times I've seen it. I love it so much when they go up to someone's house. And it's just a wide shot of the cul-de-sac. That makes it funnier somehow, too. You don't really actually see the characters. But then Ed says, can Eddy come out to play? I'm right beside you, Ed. Hi, Eddy! Like, he's so excited. And it's just so stupid. Just, I'm right beside you. I love that. It makes me laugh every time. But then they finally are able to trade when they go back to Rolf for the plums, and then it's like, oh, you want my egg? It's like, we need these plums first. And then they finally trade with the yo-yo, Ed's yo-yo, and then Rolf's like, oh, it is so simple, I'm amusing myself. Or Rolf is amusing himself, because he always refers to himself as third person. So they finally are able to trade, and they get the egg, and then of course Ed breaks it, so no omelet for them. But that episode also establishes Ed's love of chickens. Just when they're saying we should get a chicken, then Ed's like jumping on Eddy, like, oh, please, Eddy, can we get a chicken? Please, please, please. Like, so he loves chickens. Oh, gosh. I also like the episode Keeping Up with the Eds, where we see, that's where it's also first established Double Dee with his parents and all the sticky notes, how he and his parents just communicate through sticky notes, which is interesting. And then at one point he sees, oh no, I have to mow the lawn. I detest mowing the lawn. And they just have Ed do it, just like eating the grass, whatever. And then Eddy, of course, sees an opportunity. They can put all this fertilizer on everyone's grass, and then the grass grows, and they can cut all the grass. And then they go to Rolf to borrow Victor. And then when Victor eats all the grass, and then that part where Ed thinks Sarah was eaten by Victor, and she's like, where are you, Ed? He's like, I'm here, Big Brother will save you. She's like, I'm over here, stupid, the window. God, she's always so mean to him, and he's always so concerned and worried about her. Aw, little lovable Ed. I also like the episode Oath to an Ed with the Urban Rangers, when they just want the cool uniforms. And then, of course, they stink at every little thing they do, the Eds. Like, Ed messes it up each time. They're just trying to earn a badge so they can be in the Urban Rangers with Rolf and Johnny and Plank. And then the first episode of season 2 is Know-It-All Ed with the turkey basters. And then Eddy gets the idea that, oh, it's a squirt gun from Canada. And then there's the part where Ed has all the squirt guns on his face, and he just says, Canadians are weird. And that line is even funnier because this show was produced in Canada. All the voice actors are Canadian, all the writers, storyboard artists, Danny Antonucci from Canada, so they're just kind of poking fun at themselves. I also really love the episode Dear Ed, where Johnny is having a fight with Plank, and then Eddy sees the opportunity to match Johnny up with a new friend, and then they first have Bob, the cone, and he's first like gonna puke. He's like, oh, forgot the other eye. He's like, hi, Bob, and then he doesn't like Bob. Then they go to Ed's room. It's like, oh, here's another one, the shoe, like all these friends. They just have all these inanimate objects with faces on them. And then at one point, Double Dee dancing with the vase, and he says, dancing with the vase, boy, have I reached an all-time low. Oh, gosh. And when all the other kids show up, and then Johnny and Plank make up, thankfully. And then Jimmy's just dancing with them. I love that part at the end where they're just all dancing. He's like, well, if you can't beat them, show off, Eddy. And then they're just all dancing. And then Ed just like knocks them all off screen with his dancing. Oh, gosh. I also like the episode 1 + 1 = Ed, where first off, Ed asks the question to end all questions when he's just in Eddy's bed. And then he says, I can't sleep, Eddy. I keep thinking, how can my feet smell if they don't have a nose? I mean, that is a real thinker there. But then when they decide to see how stuff works, and first Eddy's like, that's stupid, but then he thinks, oh wait, we can become famous. So cash, anything with cash, that's the big motivation for him, obviously. And then this episode just gets so bizarre, where they're just playing around with the laws of cartoon physics, with Eddy just taking a bite of the sun, and then it's nighttime. And then Ed turns the tree, and then it's flat. And then Eddy takes Jimmy's outline, and Double D's like, is that Jimmy's outline? And then Eddy, like, by the house, and he just looks big compared to the background of the house. And then at one point, Double Dee says, what a discovery, I'm speechless. I mean, this is an absolute coup, the displacement of perspective. Why, where? And then Eddy interrupts and saying, I thought you were speechless. I love Double Dee with his very vast vocabulary. I also like the episode Ready, Set, Ed, where the beginning of that episode, where the Eds are in Ed's room playing with his little monster toy, because Ed, with his monster movies, he loves monsters. And then Double D's like, Ed, your toys are marvelous. And then it goes under Ed's bed. And then he's like, don't worry, I'll get it. And then there's the one part where he just goes under his bed and he loops back around. Then he sees his legs on the other side, and he just grabs his legs and he's spinning around and around on his bed. And he finally goes underneath and he pops out. He's like, I got the toy. And then like seagulls just fly out from under his bed. And then Double D's just so appalled, and he screams, Ed, how can you live this way? And he's like, I need fresh air. And then the seagulls fly out, and Ed's like, oh, Penelope, Nestor, come back. So like, oh my gosh. And then when they go out, then they see Kevin is trying to break a world record. And then Eddy, of course, competitive. He's like, so what? We could beat that. And Ed says, if only we had a sack of potatoes. And Double Dee says, potatoes wouldn't aid us in any way, Ed. Like, once in a while, you just can't tolerate Ed's, like not even humoring him. Just, no, Ed, no. But then Eddy, of course, determines to break a record. And he says, we're pros, just watch us. And then Double Dee says to Ed, there he goes, involving you and I with his use of plural pronouns. And then they're on that really high slide that they made. And then Ed just screams, plural pronouns. Ed with his non sequitur random things that he says. Just so bizarre, so funny. I also like the episode Floss Your Ed, where Ed is losing his last baby tooth. And then, of course, Eddy wants it because he wants the cash. But for their scam, they're doing that Undersea World, whatever it is. Because then Johnny pays them in coconuts, and Double D's wearing the lobster claws. And then there's the part where Eddy has a boombox of him saying, hello, I am Barnacle Ed. And you see like Ed just mouthing along to it, and he lifts his hat. You see the boombox because I guess he didn't trust Ed to say the right speech. But then poor Ed, when he bites into the coconut and his tooth. And then there's the one part where he bites into a brick and he's like, ow! And he like puts his hand over his mouth and he's squeezing his face. And then Double D's like, Ed, you should try eating softer foods. That part always makes me laugh too. And he just bites into a brick. Like, oh my goodness. And then Eddy ends up losing his tooth, and then both the teeth end up being gone. Oh gosh. And then there's the one part when they want the tooth fairy to come, and then Ed is up on his bed and he just says, I wish I had a tail, because why not? I also like the episode Hands Across Ed, when they do a telethon, and just that one part where Kevin says, this telethon stinks, and then Rolf says, yeah, I smell it. Gotta love Rolf. Rolf is hilarious. Oh my gosh. Another part that would always make me laugh as a kid. Actually, my siblings and my cousins always loved this part too. In the episode Home Cooked Eds, when the Cankers, I don't care for the Cankers much, but once in a while they're funny, but when they're vacationing, just like on the Ed's lawn, and then at one point, May is saying, Marie, flip me over, I'm getting crispy. Marie, flip me over. And then Lee just pops in. She says, shut up, May. And she just flips her over. That always made us laugh when we were kids. Oh my gosh. I don't like that they're mean to May, though. Marie and Lee. And what's interesting, too, with the Cankers is that when we meet them, and then they just take in the Eds, and it's like, oh, you like the robes? They're our dads. And they all have different names. So that means that they have different dads. I guess the same mom, though. But that's interesting, too. And they really don't look anything alike, the three sisters. But they are resourceful. They're always doing their own chores and everything. So that's one good thing about them. But the fact that they're just always the antagonists and they're always the ones to come in and ruin everything for the Eds, and just always wanting to just harass the Eds, really. The poor Eds. Gosh, they can't outwit the Canker sisters. But that episode's funny, too, when they're doing little things like Eddy with the tractor, and then when he crashes into the house and the tree, and then Double Dee says, that's something I would expect from you, Ed. And then Ed says, that's something I really wanted to do, Double Dee. And like them just kind of, I guess they've been friends so long that their little personality quirks are rubbing off on each other, because then at the end when they're cleaning, and then Eddy's like, filthy, filthy, filthy. And then Ed says, that's something I would expect from Double Dee, Eddy. And Eddy's like, don't remind me. Just little things like that. And then obviously a cool thing about this show that I loved so much when I was a kid too, I always found it so fun, but I didn't know the term for it, was all the fourth wall breaks in this show. I always loved when they referred to themselves as cartoons and broke the fourth wall. And one of those moments is in the episode Urban Ed. And first off, that one's fun with just when they're just all of a sudden like put a banana peel in Johnny's hands, like, oh, here, go shoot the banana. It's like, oh, here are the peas, here are the marshmallows, like just like having him run. It's like, oh, now run to home plate. It's like, now put a quarter in the jar, put it. It's like, no, so nice try, Eddy. And then Ed's like, I helped too, Johnny, I was the balloon guy, like whatever. And then they're like, oh, well, we gotta escape this urban life, and then they build a city, and then Johnny's like, oh, the city's smelly and dirty, and then Plank's gone. He's like, Plank, where'd you go? It's like, oh, Plank, look what the city's done to you. Him and his best buddy, Plank. So that's cute, too. He calls him my buddy. But anyway, of course, the fourth wall breaking moment when Eddy and Ed are up on one of their cardboard buildings, and then pretending to be a pigeon. And he's like, coo, coo, and then throwing yogurt, and then Ed says, quack, quack, and he drops an anvil, and then Eddy says, Ed, you're going to hurt somebody. This ain't a cartoon. I always loved that as a kid. I was like, well, but it is a cartoon. Like, no duh. But I loved that line as a kid. But that's a fun one. And then just Double Dee with his really proper, like, oh, can you see my hand signal? Because I'm trying to make a turn. I'm about to make a turn. And, like, his airbag deploys and all that. Like, just them with their city living. It's like, oh, what's this line for? Just like the kids in the city. And then, of course, when Johnny takes the jar and spills out all the quarters, and then the whole scuffle, it's like, oh, did you get any quarters? And then Double D's like, look what they did to my shirt. Poor Double D. It's like, oh, what about you, Lummox? Huh? It's like, I got him, Eddy. It's like, oh, good, give it here. And it's like, he holds up a worm. A worm? Oh, gosh. But another one is in season 1 when Ed wants to watch that movie marathon, and then they end up at Rolf's house. But then when they keep getting kicked out of everyone's house, first Ed in his own house with Sarah, and then they try to go to Kevin's house. But then at one point, Double Dee says, we could just go to our house, Eddy. And then Eddy says, what? And ruin the plot? Which, yeah, that would just take all the conflict out of it. So there you go. Then there's a moment in Don't Raid on My Ed, when they're trying to, that's in season 4, when they're trying to get to the candy store in time before it closes because it's Customer Appreciation Day so they can get free jawbreakers. And then a funny moment, though, before I mentioned the fourth wall breaking, but when Eddy's like, forget this with the scam, and then Edd just says, yes, I will. But so when they're running, and then of course the cankers show up, and then it's a close-up of Eddy, and he says, cankers, then it's a close-up of Edd, and he says, extreme close-up, just saying the stage directions. But that one, of course, just to mention, with Eddy at the end, when he's like wanting the jawbreaker, and then there's that herd of animals, and just like Double Dee saying, Eddy, help me, like with him getting just mauled by all the chickens, like he's just in the sea of chickens, and then Eddy's going back and forth, he's just like, free jawbreakers, Double Dee, and then of course it closes. So just Eddy being selfish, don't care for that. Anyway, another moment with Edd mentioning the stage direction is in the episode An Edd in the Bush. End of first sequence and fade to black. And then in Cry Edd, which is in the season 2 finale, where Double Dee says when he's running, and then he says, for heaven's sake, I think I've lost about 10 pounds this season. Just all the running around, I guess. Then there's the episode Edd Overboard, when they have to swear on the Urban Ranger book, whatever. And then Double Dee says, do it for Edd, Eddy. And Eddy says, I'd swear, but standards won't let me. And then in the episode Stuck in Edd, when Eddy can't think of a scam, so then he wants to buy a scam off of someone, and then Jimmy has this idea to get refrigerators, and then he makes all these popsicles. But then Double Dee says, have faith, Eddy. After all, you did teach him everything you know. Oh yeah, I did. Didn't we win an Emmy for that episode? Hardly. And he's referring to the episode where they have to babysit Jimmy because Sarah has her ballet class, and then Jimmy just kind of is looking up to Edd, and then Eddy decides to be a mentor to Jimmy to teach him all his scamming ways, and then Jimmy just outsmarts him with doing the trampoline scam. And then there's that one moment where he says, like, oh, I made the trampoline out of synthetic dolly hair. I was like sewing it together, and then Double Dee says, I never would have thought of that. And then Jimmy says, of course you wouldn't. And then Double Dee just says, well, like, he's offended. And then another one is Robin Edd, where Double Dee is fed up with Eddy, and he says, Eddy, how could you? You falsely swindled those unsuspecting children out of their allowances. Oh, I know, that's what we do in every show, but not like this. Which, yep, every episode, for the most part, just their failed scams. Trying to trick the kids, and then, of course, it never works out. And then in season 3, also they would, as the series progressed too, they would just poke fun at even the structure of the episodes and just things like that. So in the episode For Your Edd Only, when Eddy steals Sarah's diary, and then at the beginning of the episode, Eddy is trying to chew the bubble gum that Double Dee made, and then Ed's like, I'm in my happy place, Double Dee, and he just takes the bubble gum. So the bubble gum comes back at the end when they blow the bubble to get away from Sarah. And then at the end when they're all stuck together from the bubble gum. And Double Dee says, once again, our day ends with the 3 of us. And then Eddy interrupts him saying, stuck together in some nutty way. But wait, we have a guest tonight. And then you see Johnny stuck to the wall sideways. And Edd says, I like the way Johnny's stuck. I remember I loved that as a kid too. Because then, that's what's great about this show, that it was such strong, character-driven stories that they were able to kind of, every once in a while, break away from it and draw attention to that. So that was clever. And then in the episode, Brother, Can You Spare an Edd? That's when Edd uses Sarah's allowance to buy jawbreakers, because first she gave him her allowance to get her and Jimmy fudge. And then there's the part where Double Dee's like the angel on Edd's shoulder, and Eddy is the devil, convincing him to get jawbreakers. And that's the only episode, in fact, in the show where they actually eat an entire jawbreaker. Sometimes when they get a jawbreaker, then they lose it or something like that. But, because in that first episode, too, the Edd Touchables, when they got the jawbreakers at the end, but then they lose them and then they're running down the road trying to get the jawbreakers. But so in this one, they actually eat the entire jawbreaker. But of course, it comes at a price because they used Sarah's money. But then when they're walking back, Eddy says, you were supposed to let it melt in your mouth, Edd, not swallow it. Oh, it's kicking the little whatchamacallit, because it looks like he's pregnant with like the round jawbreaker in his belly. And then Double Dee says, how could I do such a thing? I don't even know who I am anymore. And then Ed says, you should write your name on your underwear, Double Dee. See, I'm hand wash only. And then Double Dee's like all crying and upset. And Eddy says, what's with you? What's with me? Self-abomination, Eddy. Ed was entrusted with a task, and I became embroiled in the breach of that trust. My hands are contaminated by the filth of chicanery. Oh, what dastardly deed have we sown? Who writes this guy's stuff? That's Eddy. But then they have to come up with a scam to get Sarah her money back, and then Eddy's like, oh, wedgies. And then at the end, then finally Eddy gets his comeuppance where they're just hitting Eddy with the mallet like he's a piñata or whatever. Or first they were doing that with Double Dee and Ed, but then finally Eddy gets his comeuppance. And then back to season 2, in the episode Key to My Ed, where Double Dee finds a key, and then they're trying to figure out what it opens. And then at one point Double Dee says, Eddy, let's return the key to whomever lost it, then we'll know what it opens. And Eddy says, what, and ruin all this frustration? And then as he's saying that, Ed is just crawling on the ground, like scooting across the ground with his eyebrow. I love that little dumb animation gag. It's so funny. Oh my god. And then Eddy just stops, like he looks like, what the heck is this kid doing? But then another fourth wall breaking moment where Johnny's just sleeping the whole episode, and then at one point when Johnny just falls into Eddy's arms and Eddy says, does this guy sleep through the whole show? And then when the Cankers show up, and then he's like, hey, Cankers, trade ya, and he throws Johnny at them, and then Johnny's just asleep on Lee, and Lee just screams, get this thing off me! That's so stupid. And then, of course, the key ends up being Ed's key, the key to Ed's house. He's like, oh, I got the key right here. I just must have fell in this hole in my pants, like just right through his pants. He's like, Ed, you idiot, this is your key. Oh, gosh. Another one of my favorite episodes as a kid, though, and now, is Stop Lookin' Ed, when they keep breaking all the rules. And then I always loved the part where, of course, the part where Ed's playing with Double Dee's ant farm and all the ants fall, and then Double Dee's like, pick up all those ants, Ed. And then when first Eddy is messing up all of Double Dee's labels, and Double Dee just getting so upset, and then he's just running, and then because his hat is tied up on the ceiling fan, and then when his hat pops off, and then you don't see it, but you just see Ed's and Eddy's reactions, and they're just like, whoa. And then he just puts his hat back on. He says, if you tell anyone, I'll never be friends with you again. And as a kid, I loved that moment. It just like drove me crazy. Like, what's under Double Dee's hat? And to this day, it's still a mystery. And everyone has their theories, I'm sure. And when I was a kid, I will say that I still think it's a good theory, that I thought it was just part of his brain was exposed. That's what I thought as a kid. Because then afterwards he's wearing pantyhose on his head, and he's like, oh, his brain's squished. He's wearing those pantyhose. And then when they end up in the cage, and he's like, oh, please assist, help. And then Ed just says, ketchup. Oh gosh, when it's just all mayhem with the rules. But with that darn hat, I mean, apparently we were supposed to find out because Danny Antonucci had said that if we make a feature, and they did make a movie for the finale, it was a TV movie, not a feature, which that would have been awesome, seeing a actual theatrical film for Edd and Eddy. That would have been cool. But I think actually it's just better off being left a mystery. I know for a fact not even Samuel Vincent, who voices Double Dee, knows what's under his hat. I guess no one knows, just Danny Antonucci himself. Unless he was just doing that on purpose. Maybe he doesn't even know. Maybe that's the whole thing. Like, you're not meant to know. It's just nothing will actually, if you see whatever it was, it wouldn't be as cool as just whatever you think in your own imagination what's under his hat. I know there's like darker theories too that I don't really want to touch on those. But also, like, there was a moment in a video game apparently where he takes off his hat and just like you see his hair, but that's not actually canon. So it was never actually confirmed what's under his hat. So I always thought it was part of his brain or something like that, because what's going to be under there? I don't know, some kind of weird beauty mark maybe, something just bizarre like that. So whatever it is, though, he's just wearing the old ski hat, and he's sockhead. But I will say, I think this is still my favorite episode, my all-time favorite episode, because I loved it so much as a kid, and still my favorite, I would say. I love the episode Mirror, Mirror on the Edd. The episode where the Edds all dare each other to act like one another. And the beginning of it, though, when they're just all on a walk. And it's a great moment that sums up all their personalities. You just see, that reminds me too, first, Eddy where he runs through the puddle, and then Edd, he runs through it, he falls into it, and then Double Dee, as he's running, then he stops just before he runs into it, and then he puts up a caution sign. That sums up their personalities so well. But having said that, that reminds me that Danny Antonucci also said that when coming up with this show, the characters went through all different walk cycles, so how they move and everything, and that is very distinctive, particularly for the Edds. And that's something I noticed too, maybe not overtly, but subconsciously, but it is something I picked up on as a kid, how the Edds, when they run, so distinct, where you got Edd with his head hanging back, because it's just his heavy head, he can't keep it up, and him was just always laughing. That's so distinctive of his character too. And then you got Double Dee when he runs with his elbows up, just like all prim and proper basically. And then Eddy when he runs, he's just kind of like charging forward with his hands in front of him, and often with his tongue hanging out, just like charging forward, the real go-getter. So that's all very distinctive of their personalities as well. So that's really clever too. But then in this episode, then when they run off the cliff, and then W's like, improbable alert, and then, just classic cartoon antics, and then Ed's like, I can jump it, guys, and they pull him back. And it's like, we gotta think. It's like, how are we gonna get across the cliff? And then Edd says, can I think? No! They both shout, no! But then when they're playing Truth or Dare, and they're doing it like with the spin the bottle, and just whoever lands on, that's who has to pick Truth or Dare. And then it lands on Jimmy, and Jimmy says, dare me, sucker. And then Kevin says, I dare you to skip your turn. And then when the Edds show up, then everyone just leaves. And it lands on Eddy, and then Ed's like, okay, I dare you, Eddy, to sprout wings, or whatever he says. And then Double's like, Edd, try a more reasonable dare, please. Okay, I dare Eddy to be like Double Dee. It's like, oh, why, yeah, that's stupid, Edd. And then it's like, actually, I'd be, whatever he says, flattered if you were to mimic me. So then Eddy acts like Double Dee. It's like, oh, let's see the wind resistance, whatever he says, like Double Dee. And then when it lands on Double Dee, it's like, oh no. And it's like, oh, I dare you to be Edd. And he says, well, I suppose, but only if Edd will be Eddy. And then Ed's so excited, he's like, oh, I could be Eddy, I practiced. And Eddy's like, what do you mean you practice? He's like, come on, Double Dweeb. And he just like puts his eyes together to act like Eddy. That just must have been so fun for the voice actors to still be their characters, acting like each other. I think that's just so clever, too. And then when Double Dee acts like Edd, he just, like, pulls his eyes apart, and he's like, gravy or buttered toast, of course. Edd's go-to foods. And then they take it up a notch even more, and they're dressed like each other. And then Eddy's like, oh, I found this rock. He's like, oh, hello, Kevin, may I inspect your nostrils? Just everything about this episode, I love it. Start to finish, it's fantastic. And then when Rolf wants Edd to help him, like squishing the grapes or whatever, and then Eddy's like, oh, I'm quite partial. And Double D's like, parched. The word you're looking for is parched. And then Edd as Eddy is like, gee, kids will pay tons of cash. You're a genius, Double D. And then Double D's like, oh, you really think I'm a genius? And then Eddy's like, oh, hey, I'm Double D. I'm the genius. And then when Sarah thinks Double Dee is Edd, of course, and then Double Dee ends up in Ed's room, he's like, oh no, it's a tub of gravy! And then Edd as Eddy, like, oh, I made everyone uncomfortable because I'm Eddy. And then when Eddy ends up in Double Dee's room, and then Kevin's gonna beat him up, and then Eddy ends up, like, Johnny runs into him, it's like, oh, hi, Edd, I mean Eddy. And then at the end, it's like, what's that, Eddy? Oh, what a potty mouse. And then Edd is acting like Plank. It's just fantastic. I love that episode. Oh my gosh. Another one I loved as a kid is Honor Thy Edd, when the Edds just go into that weird abandoned house. It's just in that one episode and never again in the cul-de-sac. But first they're trying to make tacos, and then Edd is eating the grated cheese, which is just crayon shavings, and then Double D's like, does that really taste like cheese? And then when he bites, he's trying to test the theory, like, oh, you are a banana, and he bites into the crayon. And then when he drinks, he's like, I need water. He drinks Eddy's brother's hot sauce, and then all of a sudden they're on fire. Then they're on the sprinkler. But then they go into that house because Kevin dares him, like he bets him a jawbreaker, and then when they go in, and they're messing with everyone. And just a rare moment of Sarah caring about her brother when they think they're getting hurt. And then she's like, someone help my idiot brother! Just a rare moment, which that's nice. I mean, gosh, you think once in a while, just a smidge, she's nice to him, that's good. However fleeting. And then Double Dee goes up to the library, and then Ed sees Chunky Puffs, and then it ends up being, of course, the Kankers having tricked them. And Double Dee's like, it's a wedding, Eddy, but I can't dance, Eddy. Ed. And then Lee's like, pick out your grooms and spit out your gum. And then they put, like, rings on them. It's like, oh, you had your ring all along. Also, the episode Scrambled Ed is great, where Double D is just so exhausted because he spent 14 hours building that little toothpick bridge. And then Eddy has an idea for the scam, Ed's Sea Ranch. But Double D's just exhausted. And then still, though, he's still able to just... impressive, even though he's, like, half asleep. And he's just able to come up with plans for the Sea Ranch. And then he's like, supplies and materials. And then Ed gives him first. It's like, here you go. It's like, he asked for a pen. He asked for mustard, Eddy. And he just draws up all the plans. And they get all the supplies. And then everyone just asking advice for Double D, and just kind of like the fabric of their kid society unraveling just because Double D is asleep and they don't have Double D's rationality and his expertise to help them out. When he just keeps saying all this random stuff, he's like, toothpaste or whatever he says, wax for more manageable follicles. And then Ralph's like, oh yes, the wax, to get the lobsters out. And then when Kevin asks him with his bike chain, he's like, oh, toothpaste for a cleaner, brighter smile. And then Johnny goes to him and is like, Double D, can you help us? Plank's got this growth. And then Double D just laughs. And then with the Sea Ranch, with blocking the water, and then just everything explodes and they're just underwater. Just goes to a mess just because Double D is tired and not himself. Then there's that episode, Boys Will Be Eds, where most of the boys develop a crush on Naz. Really, it's the Eds and Johnny and Kevin. But it's already established, though, that the Eds all like Naz and Kevin, really. And that's what's interesting, too, that they all like the same girl. It's like kind of how they all react around her. Like Eddy, where he's always so boisterous, and then he's tongue-tied around her. And Ed just, like, breaks into a sweat. And then Double D, he, like, can't even face her. There's that one episode, too, where she invites him to a barbecue, and he just, like, turns around. He's like, I'd be delighted. Like, he can't even, like, look her in the eyes, huh? But in the episode To Sir with Ed, where Eddy thinks he's on a date with Naz, because they're like, look who's making dinner in my kitchen. And then they see it's Naz, and then Double D's like, you don't think this could be a date? But then it turns out she's actually just there to babysit him. But, oh my gosh. Then there's that part, though, where Eddy says, the date's off. And then he's, like, in the drawer. And he's like, Naz scares me. The date's off. A rare moment of Eddy actually being vulnerable. He seems so confident and sure of himself all the time. He does have a temper on him, too. He gets angry really easily when the scams get messed up. But I like that moment, though. And then at the end, it's like, my parents hired you to date me? And she's like, they hired me to babysit you, dude. Like, aw, poor Eddy. I also like the episode Hot Buttered Ed, when they go down to the creek. And by the way, the name of this little town is Peach Creek. That's something I didn't realize as a kid. It's called Peach Creek, where they live. So then, but first when they're just having a little sleepover, the Eds, like, how cute is that? But so they're having a sleepover and they're making hand puppets in the tent. And Double D says, did you know hand puppetry is one of the oldest forms of entertainment? And Ed just says, like walnuts? His random lines, oh my gosh. But then when they're down at the creek and Eddy wants his spot, but Kevin's there, and then just the whole time they're waiting, and then they get sunburns. I also like the episode High Heeled Ed, when it's just Naz, Sarah, and Jimmy, because the other kids went go-karting, and then they have to get in touch with their feminine side. And then when Eddy learns that they like jewelry because he sees how upset, he's like, did you see that? All those emotions over stupid jewelry? Like how upset Sarah got when she thought she lost her earring. So then they just have all this gold merchandise, just all the stuff that they painted in gold paint. And then at one point when Ed's like, can openers, my mom loves can openers, our mom's girls, well, technically, beats me. And then when his pants are all in the gold paint, and then Jimmy wants them, it's like $5 for the pants. And then when they break, Double D's like, exposed, and Eddy says busted, and Ed says nope, can't think of a word. But then when they all walk off, and then all of a sudden Ed has a rare intellectual moment where he says, spending an extended time in female company can be mentally disorientating and physically confusing. What's up with you? Ed's trouserless state seems to have jarred an intellectual moment within the confines of his brain. Edd, is that you? Hug me! Well, that didn't last long. Oh gosh. I also like the pseudo-Christmas episode, Fa La La Edd, where it's Christmas in July, basically. And then it's Piggy Bank Day, and then, of course, Eddy wanting to scam the kids, saying, oh, we'll smash your piggy bank. And then when they take off the giant pig robot mechanism thing, and then you see Double Dee there to smash it. He's like, oh, I'm so ashamed. Poor Double Dee, all upset, feeling guilty. And then Jimmy's like, Merry Christmas, Double Dee, offering the piggy bank anyway, which is sweet. And they're just caroling. It's like, give us cash or we'll stop singing. Just like all the Christmas carols with cash thrown in with the lyrics. And at the end, when Edd gives away all the jawbreakers, like, what would you like from Santa, little boy? He just gives away all the jawbreakers. So that's cute, though, that the spirit of Christmas. And he gave away all the jawbreakers. Because as Double Dee says, it's not about getting gifts, it's about giving joy. That's cute. And then I remember the commercial for this episode specifically, Once Upon an Edd. I remember, like, all the new episodes of Edd, Edd, and Eddy, and like they teased this episode with the Edd stuck in Johnny's wall. And I remember just also the one with Double Dee with all the sticky notes. Just a few of those episodes. And then the one also with they want the quarter, but it's stuck to the ground, and then when they pull it off, and it just was because it had gum underneath, so that's why it was stuck to the ground, because cartoon logic. But anyway, with the episode Once Upon an Edd, when they're just in Johnny's wall, you never learn why they actually are, but Johnny's saying, hey, why are you in my wall? It's like, yeah, tell me a story. It's like, well, tell him a story about how they got stuck in the wall. And we never actually learn what it is, but it's a clever episode where they're just each telling their own interpretation of a story. And Eddy just, of course, in his version that he's like top dog and everyone loves him, and then he's got his jawbreaker bank, and then Double Dee in his, and then like him scolding Edd and Eddy because they're really the troublemakers, the two of them, really Eddy, but Edd because he doesn't know any better. And then in Ed's store where things just get really weird really quickly. And it's so funny though when in his story when Double Dee's speaking, he's like blah 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 blah, yep dribble dribble dribble, like because I guess he doesn't understand him. So that's how Double Dee is in Ed's story. And then there's that part where just the cankers take over and they got like chickens. It's just so weird, and like they mash their heads together, just this giant cyclops monster thing. And Eddy says, Edd, your story's getting weird. But after Eddy's story, when Double Dee says, pure fiction, Eddy, your exaggerated tale can only be described as cockamamie, and Edd says, tisk tisk tisk, I have never heard such language. But then when Johnny falls asleep, and then of course the cankers come and take the Edds out of Johnny's wall one by one. And another one where I remember the little preview, like the little commercial for it, the episode Will Work for Edd, where Rolf hires Edd as his nincompoop to do chores with the farm animals. But I just remember that moment. It's like, why don't you use the nincompoop entrance? Okie dokie, boss. Him walking through the fence. I just remembered that in the commercial way back when for this show. But I love the moment where Edd is getting ready for work, and Double Dee and Eddy are kind of being like his parents. So then Double Dee says, now I've taken the liberty to pack you a lunch. No more than an hour, understand? Punctuality shows you're a real go-getter. Be courteous and tackle each task to the best of your ability. Watch your posture and use soap when you wash your hands. Hey, and find out how much you're making, will ya? Bye, dear! That made me, like, just burst out laughing, too. Because I guess it's just him, like, bye, dear, like, just mimicking his dad, I guess, or something, leaving for work. But then he just goes into the car. Well, because first Double Dee says, he's on his own now, Eddy, ready to carve his niche in this dog-eat-dog world we call home. And he gets into the car, and Eddy's just laughing. He's like, Edd, no, you're too young to drive. Just mimicking his dad. So that's funny, too. Oh, gosh. But then when he goes to Rolf, he's like, no, well, this will be deducted from your pay. And he's like, deducted? And then they have to help Edd peeling the potatoes and all that. And at the end, when Double Dee and Eddy are also working, and then Ed's like, this guy, no problem. And then, like, he's doing a good job. It's like, but this guy with Eddy and his, like, chicken coop is still a mess. And then they're like, hey, nincompoop. And then they both say, and then Rolf's like, you did good, nincompoop. Like, it's cute. I do like Rolf's dynamic with the Edds. I like Johnny's dynamic with the Edds, too. And as I said, I don't really care for Kevin. He's just always bullying them. Don't care for Sarah either, really. Jimmy's all right. He's interesting, too, with the Eds, because then once in a while his dark side just unleashes. So that's interesting, too. But then another nice, sweet moment with Ed, too, in the episode Edd or Tails, when he gets 2 jawbreakers. And then he's like, I will share them with my friends. And then, because he ordered it or something. And then Eddy's like, Ed, how does 2 go into 3? And then, like, it takes him overnight. It's like, should we tell him? It's like, he's a big boy, Ed. And then he finally realizes that there's not enough jawbreakers. And then he's like, here, my friends, that you guys could have them. And, of course, Eddy is just quick to go eat it. But then Double D says, like, we have to share these. Like, you're so predictable, Eddy. Thank goodness for Double D, ever the virtuous one. Being fair. But then they lose one of the jawbreakers. They're first going to divide them into 3 shares. And they lose one because it ends up just flying out, and then Johnny eats. It's like, hey, we got a jawbreaker. Plank, where'd you go, buddy? And like he's inside his mouth with the jawbreaker. So then they're competing for the other jawbreaker, and they just end up losing it to, of course, Eddy trying to cheat, and then Ed ends up winning, but then it just goes flying out, and they're in the water trying to look for it, and then at the end he found it, and it's like, oh, tell me, Ed, what flavor is it? And then it's like, oh, it kind of tastes like chicken. And then he opens his mouth and it's a snail. And then Double D's like, Ed, you spit that out right now. And then Ed stopped. Eddy, listen to me, I can mix up the names. Eddy says, gee, Ed, you sure are lucky. I wish I was you. Gosh. Then there's the episode, The Luck of the Ed. And I like the beginning of it where Double D is trying to demonstrate something to Ed. And he's saying, this is one of my favorites, Ed. Note, 1 small object and 1 large object. And he's got a marble and Ed's got a bowling ball. And he says, now, and this is the riveting part, if we drop both objects in unison, that's at the same time, Ed. One would assume the large object would land first. Au contraire, objects of different masses do fall at the same rate. Isn't that amazing? And then he goes to drop it, but Ed's not paying attention. He's like, Ed, you aren't paying attention. And then Eddy just storms in. He's like, here, hide these magazines. You know, his magazines. Wink, wink. Don't pick up on that as a kid. But then he just gets all paranoid. It's like, what'd you do with the magazines? Because then, of course, when he asks Ed to hide them, Ed doesn't remember where he put them. And then he thinks, it's like, oh, they're over here, Eddy, like in the sandbox. And it's like, oh, good, bring them over here. And then at one point he says, I tell you I love you, Ed, but I ain't that kind of guy. His magazines. And then Double D's like, oh, you actually read those? Like, yep, we know. And then in season 4, a great one is Little Ed Blue, when Ed is just in a bad mood. Because he's always in such a great happy mood. So then, what if he was in a bad mood? So that's a clever premise, too. And then the only reason he's in a bad mood, though, is because he had a pebble in his shoe. So it's like the whole time they're trying to cheer him up, and Eddy even dresses up like a chicken, all these things. And Double D's saying, I want you to know I'm here for you, and giving you a hug, like that's cute. He's trying to help him out. And then it just turns out he had a pebble in his shoe, and then he's perfectly himself again, Ed. I also like the episode A Twist of Ed, which does feature the Cankers, but it's the Eds trying to use, like, Double D decides, like, oh, we have to use reverse psychology on them, so that if they act all sweet and nice to the Cankers, that they'll let off. And then first Ed's like, oh, may I have this dance, like, trying to woo the Cankers, and then they start getting weirded out. So that ends up working until Eddy just, like, is too nervous, and that little bead of sweat, and then Lee realizes that they can turn around on them again. So then it's a reverse psychology. Because first, earlier in the episode, Double D demonstrates, Ed, don't eat that dirt. And then, like, of course, he eats it. It's like, that's reverse psychology. So it worked until they outsmarted them yet again, the Canker sisters. I also like the episode Hand Me Down Ed with the boomerang. When each character has the boomerang, it just makes them the opposite of their personality. So Jimmy, and then he's like this tough guy. Or Rolf is an opera singer. Or Sarah's all cute and cuddly. It's like, I'm fine, Double D, hug for you too. Like, hugging everyone. It's like, oh, hi, big brother. And then she's actually all sweet and nice. And Ed's so happy. It's like, oh, baby sister's all sweet and cuddly. Like, the inside of whatever he says. Like, Dad's bushy ears or something like that, he says. Oh, gosh. But just another moment that I think sums up all the Ed's personalities so well. When they're doing another scam, of course. And then Eddy says, Double D, act natural. Ed, shut up and I'll do all the talking. Misrepresenting toothpaste as a character-enhancing ointment is far beyond my scope of vocabulary, Eddy, and I don't have a clue what's going on here, Eddy. Like, of course, he never knows what's going on. He's just always happy to help out, but clueless Ed. Then Ed with the boomerang is intellectual. And then as soon as he, like, throws it, then he's, like, rolling around, literally rolling on the ground, laughing, like, ha, 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 ha. I love his laugh. Oh, gosh. That reminds me, too. His laugh is great. And then Eddy, he's always, like, barking out a laugh so obnoxious. Then Double Dee, when he laughs, he often, like, covers his mouth, like, like a little more contained laugh. And then there are several half-hour specials. In this season, season 4, there's If It Smells Like an Edd, where it's Friendship Day. And they're singing that song, if you stub your toe and it hurts you, no friends are there to help you. But it's a clever episode. I remember watching it at the time and thinking how they mislead you to think, because of those candies that Rolf is eating, that with those candies that show up, that you think it's Rolf that's trying to frame the Edds for everything. But it turns out that it was Jimmy all along behind it, because he was embarrassed when Eddy gave him a wedgie, which that's mean. So again, Jimmy with his clever, cunning, evil side outsmarts the Edds, getting back at them after Eddy humiliated him. And then, of course, when the cankers show up at the end. So that's a fun one, too. And there's another fourth wall breaking moment before the act break when Edd says, I'll have my legs back, like the feeling back in my legs after the word from our sponsors, Double Dee, and Double Dee carrying the cement block with the boot print on it because they're using that as evidence to figure out who's framing them. And then he says, curse broadcast commercialism. And then the season 4 finale, which was originally the series finale until the show was picked up for another season, Take This Edd and Shove It, when they're starting to grow up, and then Eddy's just saying, I'm going to be a kid forever, and Double D's saying, well, he's excited about the prospect of growing up, and saying that that's part of life. And then they do a new scam where they tell everyone their careers, and then Eddy wakes up old, and then because first, so Naz was a dentist, and Sarah's a traffic light, all these things, and Rolf wants to be a barber, and then he makes the hair just like his. So then when she takes the jawbreakers from them, Naz, and puts it in the drawer and locks it up, and then he's trying to break free. And then when they're old, and then he just keeps waking up, and he's like, oh, I'm young, and then he wakes up, he's old again. So it ends with them being old. And there were actually a couple deleted scenes in that episode when he's old Eddy, and then he wants to be young again, and then at one point he says, okay, Antonucci, like just talking to Danny Antonucci, like, okay, cartoon director. And then there was also another deleted scene with the cankers. It's like, oh, we married the cankers? Like, and they have all these grandkids, I guess. So that was originally the series finale for the show. Until then it was renewed. And then with season 5, that's when, with the first episode of that season, Out with the Old and with the Edd, another half-hour episode, which is another great one. But that's when summer ends. After perpetual summer, it comes to an end, and then it's fall now. So then they did stories in school. So that was clever, too. And still they stuck with the same 12 characters. They didn't have to add any more, so that's amazing, too. But in that episode, Out with the Old and with the Edd, when Eddy's trying to trick them that it's still summer, but then they're realizing it's the first day of school tomorrow. And apparently, just another random fun fact, that the part when the whole water slide thing crashes, and then Eddy says, good times, yep. Like, very strained. Apparently that took over 200 takes, because Danny Antonucci had it just right the way he wanted to hear it in his head. So that took many, many takes for just that little tiny line. So there's a fun fact for you. And then the second half of that episode, though, is them in school, and they find out they're all in different homerooms, so then they have to go to the Kanker sister to see if they can all be in the same homeroom. Then there's the episode Mission Edd Possible, where Edd and Eddy are trying to stop Double Dee from bringing the report cards to their parents. And actually, there is a moment, though, at the end of that episode where you see Eddy's dad's big hand grab him, like he's angry at him for getting bad grades, and you see Edd's aunt, like, oh, aunt is bad for Edd, Eddy, like his aunt. So you see their hands. So not entirely, still just the hands, not the whole character, but there was that moment. And then there's the episode Every Which Way But Edd, where it's all just these bunch of flashbacks, because Eddy has a jawbreaker, and then Double D's like, oh, how'd you get that jawbreaker? It's like, well, I ran into Johnny, and first, at the beginning of that episode, Double Dee is showing Edd static electricity. It's like, here, now you try with the slippers. And he has that smile on his face, Edd, and then he just keeps going around and around, and just the whole thing electrocutes, like, so powerful. But then all the flashbacks, and there's one part where they flash back so far that they go back to when they first meet, And Edd and Eddy were friends first, and they were trying to scam Double Dee. So that's how they first met, when Double Dee moves to the cul-de-sac. And they're so cute when they're little. It's like, oh yeah, watch Bottomless Ed eat this TV. For you, only a quarter. And you see Double Dee with his little hat, keeps falling over his eyes. It's just so cute. You see Ed with his one strand of hair and his tooth. It's very adorable with them little. I also like the episode Too Smart for His Own Ed, where it's a spelling bee, and the beautiful irony that Double Dee ends up losing and Ed wins on the word gravy. Double Dee accidentally misspells it. But there's a part where Rolf is so nervous up there, and he's like, Rolf's mind goes blank. And then he just screams, curse the monkey ritual of English words. He just knocks over the microphone, and you just hear one person clapping. He's like, thank you, Nana. Like, thank you, Nana. But then everyone thinks Ed is smart and asking for advice for their homework. And Double Dee saying to Eddy, like, oh, I miss those days when you used my intellect for your own monetary gain. And at the end, he says to Ed, I'm really proud of you for doing well in the spelling bee. Because first he was upset because his little winning streak was over, poor Double Dee. And then Ed's all happy with Double Dee, like, cookies at my house, Double Dee, with lots of mayonnaise. Oh, goodness. There's something. And then I also like the episode All Eds Are Off, when they have a bet to give up their annoying habits. Like, who can go the longest without their annoying habits? They each bet a quarter. Ed has to give up gravy, Eddy has to give up yelling, Double Dee has to give up saying words with more than one syllable, Kevin gives up saying dorks, and Johnny has to give up being bossed around by Plank. And then one by one, they just keep giving in, and then Eddy's trying to trick them, basically. But first, Double Dee's just, like, straining to only use one syllable words. Like, no, it is fun to speak like this, like just one syllable words. And at the end, Eddy tries to trick Ed into eating gravy, then he goes into this, what you think is a vat of gravy, then it turns out to be butterscotch pudding, so then Ed ends up winning the bet. Oh, and Ralph was in it too, I forgot he had to give up meat. And then there are several holiday specials. There's Ed, Edd and Eddy's Boo Ha Ha, which is the Halloween episode. There's Ed, Edd and Eddy's Hanky Panky Hullabaloo, which is the Valentine's episode. That's the episode where it's Cupid Sarah and Cupid Jimmy. And they have May fall in love with Double Dee, and then they just hit Double Dee with the arrows, and he falls in love with May. Because first May was all upset that Ed rejected her little Valentine card, like, Big Ed hates me, poor May. And then Double Dee felt bad, so he crossed off Naz's name on the Valentine's Day card, and we just wrote May. So then they're just all lovey-dovey with just the hearts and the over-the-top being in love. It's cute though, but it's funny. And then just all of them end up falling in love with different things. Like Eddy falls in love with Plank, that was funny. And Ed falls in love with the sandwich. And then you had Johnny and Naz, and you had Kevin and Lee, that was interesting. And then Rolf is the only one that when he throws sludge on them, and then they're all back to normal, and he's like, now your miserable lives have been restored. And at the end though, Double Dee, he sees something in his hat, and it's the little love note that May had written for him earlier, and then he just has like a moment where he stares at it and he just puts it back, so that was interesting. I also like the actual Christmas episode, Edd and Eddy's Jingle, Jingle, Jangle, and this whole exchange is so funny to me between Ed and Double Dee. I feel all fuzzy inside, Double Dee. 'Tis the season, Ed. 'Tis the warmth, Ed. The fuzzy feeling. It's the spirit of the holiday. Spirit? From here, Ed. My udder. You certainly know how to tax one's patience, Ed. Like, he has his hand over his heart, and he's like, my udder? And then there's a part later in the episode where Double Dee says, the true meaning of Christmas isn't about materialistic needs or selfish wants. Rather, it comes from here. And he puts his hand over Eddy's heart. And then Eddy says, that's my udder you're touching. Like his udder. But Eddy just wanted to just crash in on other people's Christmases. He's being selfish as always. And then there's the one part, though, where he just does a selfless act because Ed had put the little Christmas bulb in his pants pocket earlier in the episode, and he just he sees that the light is off on the tree, and he changes the light with a new one. So the one little act of kindness. So that's nice too, and then Double D's so proud of him. And there's a moment where it's like the nativity scene. That's a fun episode. I like that one. And then this episode apparently was first advertised as the series finale, called A Fistful of Ed, where Double Dee was mistaken as being violent because he keeps accidentally hurting people, first by dropping a book on Lee's foot, and then by it's revealed after the fact how he accidentally tripped over Whiteout and then kicked Rolf, and at first you don't see that, so it looks like he actually hurt them. But this apparently was falsely advertised as the series finale, and it's another half-hour episode. But it's another episode where they kind of break away from the norm, and then at the end, when Jimmy's trying to help out Double Dee, they're going to fight, but then Eddy keeps, like, egging him on and throwing hot dogs, and then Johnny at one point says, I don't know where he's getting all those hot dogs, Plank. But then Jimmy actually gets angry because of Eddy. And then at the end, when the Cankers show up, and Double Dee's like, a little late for an entrance, don't you think? And they're like, oh, let's kiss him, make him feel better. And then Eddy's standing up for him, saying, hey, he's had enough already, beat it. Good one, Eddy. Vultures. Goodness, Eddy, I'm touched. You standing up to a cliche show ending for me. Let me tell you, after the day I've had, a dose of camaraderie, really. And then he shoves a hot dog into his mouth, and he's like, yeah, shut up, and eat and shut up. And then Ed says, and for your Ed, Eddy? And then he takes the hot dog and puts it in Ed's mouth, and then Double Dee says, Eddy, I thought that was my hot dogs. And he gives him another one. And he's like, thank you, Eddy. And then Eddy takes out another hot dog. He's like, there's everybody happy? Good, jeez. So a rare moment of them just him sticking up for his pal, because I never liked when he, like, would antagonize Double Dee either, when he was just mean to him just for his own enjoyment, because it's always Eddy, just always wanting to just cause trouble and mischief. But there is more nuance to his character, too, because in the series finale, Ed, and Eddy's Big Picture Show, that's when he really has his breakout emotional moment, his realization and the true motivation behind everything for Eddy. And that true motivation is that he just wants to be liked by the other kids. And so really, with all these scams with everything, and him just being a show-off and just manipulative with the kids, and even with the Eds, him as the brains behind all these scams, coming off as this confident, cocky kid, there really is more nuance to him, where it's not just about wanting cash and wanting jawbreakers, it's really just about wanting to be accepted. So he doesn't really go about the right way of that, but that's something that too I appreciate about his character, that he is insecure and more vulnerable than he lets on. It's really just him protecting his ego when he does all that big show-offy stuff. But this series finale is excellent. I remember happening to catch it on Cartoon Network at the time when it aired, just by chance, and I remember thinking, oh wait, I thought the show was already over. And I remember watching most of it and just thinking that, especially particularly the ending, is just such a fitting series finale. Really, really well done. And even the opening, where it's just the cul-de-sac, seemingly quiet and calm, until you see the aftermath of a scam gone horribly wrong. And then you see the Eds are just out on the run now from the other kids because they injured them so badly. And you see Ed nervously packing, and Double Dee writing a goodbye note to his parents, and then he keeps messing up, and then he folds it in the trash. Like, you just see his trash neatly with folded papers. And then when they're just on the run, and they get the idea, Eddy gets the idea to go to his big bro's place. And we don't know much about Eddy's big brother, except everything he tells us, the audience, and tells the kids throughout the show. But basically that he's a prankster. And Eddy really looks up to him, though. And he just says all this great stuff about his brother, so then they figure they can go stay with Eddy's brother. And I like the part, too, when they're in that field, and then Eddy says, you need a brain, Ed. Come on, Eddy, have a heart, courage. Like that little Wizard of Oz type thing where Ed needs a brain, Eddy needs a heart, and Double Dee needs courage. That's clever. And then it's just the other characters trying to get to them, with Rolf and Naz and Kevin just is more concerned about his bike. And then Johnny with his melon head alter ego again, and then Splinter the Wonderwood with Plank. And then Sarah and Jimmy are just, they weren't involved with the scams, and they just want to go watch the Eds getting beat up. And then they end up with the Cankers, though, and the Cankers go, we gotta go help our boyfriends. So it's just the whole time with them trying to get to Eddy's brother. And then there's the part where they go to the gag factory, because Double Dee using all of the things they know about Eddy's brother, like the hot sauce, the stink bomb, all the things, like little callbacks to other episodes. But then they think he works there, possibly, so they go there, and then Eddy just laughing and having fun. And then Double Dee keeps using his little label maker first with the car putting out of order when they go in Eddy's brother's car. Ed's just running with the car, like Eddy's not actually driving it. And then Double Dee, when he does the label maker in the gag factory office, and he puts Dusty, Dusty, Dusty. I always like when he says stuff like that too, like messy, 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 or like when he does not good, not good. But anyway, so I like Double Dee because he's smart, so I always liked that, and that he's actually just genuinely kind and nice. He feels bad for the other kids when these scams go wrong. He's just very sensitive and sweet, and yes, he's a weakling, and yes, he can be very rigid with the rules, and Eddy always wants him to lighten up, but obviously every character has their flaws, their good qualities and their flaws, but I just always loved Double Dee. And then I love there's another tease in this finale too, with Double Dee's hat coming off again. We don't actually see it though, you just see Eddy being like, oh my eyes, and then Ed kind of touches the back of his head, so that's interesting too. Who knows with that darn hat. But then Double Dee has the final straw when he thinks Ed and Eddy are sinking in quicksand, and then he goes to throw them the rope to help them, but then he thinks they're gone. He's like, oh, my two friends gone forever. I shouldn't let them leave the cul-de-sac. And they're just standing there. And then he's finally had it, and he wants to go home. He's like, I'll just take whatever punishment I get from my parents, thinking that he doesn't have that his two friends basically are betraying him just for the sake of a joke. Or really it's all Eddy. And the whole time Eddy's saying, oh, this was your fault, this scam, you could have stopped me or whatever. And then finally, when Double Dee's leaving, and then Eddy just really breaks down, and he knows he screwed up, and then he says, fine, go home, I don't blame you, because everything was my fault. And he finally takes ownership and responsibility. And then he's just crying hysterically, because it's just so much for him, clearly, that finally this is his actual feelings coming out, that he feels bad, that he knows he screwed up. He's finally taking ownership, that he's the one that screwed up the scam, that everyone is out to get them, and he doesn't want Double Dee to leave because that's his friend. And then Double Dee just accepts the apology. It's like, oh, you're sure, Eddy? And he just does the little like flick with the nose, like, gotcha. And then they're friends again because Ed was all upset too. And then they're still going back to find Eddy's brother, and then Eddy's like, you heard my pal, Ed. And Double Dee says, what would you do without me, Eddy? And Eddy says, don't milk it, sockhead. So it's cute. I really like that sweet emotional moment with them. And then when they end up at the amusement park, Mondo a Go-Go, and then Double Dee realizes, oh wait, it's the same place, like the same picture that's on the back of the postcard that Eddy's brother sent him. So then Eddy's like, oh, he's here. And then they go to that little whale trailer. And then you just hear Pip squeak, Mom and Dad know you're here. And then we meet Eddy's brother. So the one and only other character we meet in the show. What a great reveal and everything. The only time we see another character outside of the main kids. And he's voiced by Terry Klassen, who was the voice director for the show. So that's cool, too. And he just turns out to be this absolute colossal jerk. And I want to use stronger language, but just a real bully, so mean. And then he's just beating up Eddy. And then he sees Double Dee. He's like, oh, I like your girlfriend. And Eddy's like, girlfriend? And then he's just like smacking Eddy. He's like, oh, how about we play uncle? Like, he's just being so mean. And the other kid's like, whoa, Eddy's brother's a real jerk. Poor Eddy, though. He looks up to his brother, and he's like, yo, please, bro, like, he just wants to be accepted even by his brother, and then his brother's just being awful to him. And then with his damaged ego, poor Eddy. And there's a part too, though, when the door is coming off its hinge, and Ed has this light bulb moment, a rare moment of cleverness. I liked that moment too, where he just takes the screw out of the hinge and the door goes flying off, so then Eddy's brother gets crushed with it. And then Double Dee's asking if he's okay, and Eddy says, I made it all up, Double Dee. Everything about my brother was a lie. I made things up so people would like me, think I was cool, but boy, was I wrong. The scam, my brother, this. When am I going to learn, Double Dee? And then Double Dee takes his hands and he says, I think you just have, Eddy. So that's really sweet, too. That Eddy really just being completely vulnerable now, just coming clean, being honest. And then when Eddy's brother, like, slams Double Dee into the ground with Eddy, he's like, I like you, girlfriend, you got spunk. And then everyone gets upset then. I like that moment too. Everyone's like, Double Dee! Like, because Double Dee really is the genuine sweet kid. So when they see that, it's like they all run to help him. And that's sweet to them, and it's like, oh, let's get him. And then Eddy thinks that they're going to beat him up, but then they're just all angry at Eddy's brother. And that's all it takes. Then finally, at long last, the other kids become genuine friends with them. And then Kevin's like, let's go back to my house. Jawbreaker's on me. And then you see the kangaroos just dragging Eddy's brother inside. And you see also Sarah hugging Ed. That's sweet too. And then with that resolved, that is the perfect resolution for this show. That the Eds no longer ostracized by the other kids. They are accepted by the other kids. They're all friends now. There's no need for them to do all these scams anymore because now they got all the Jawbreakers they want. So that really is, I really love that actual perfect conclusion to the series. And then when Eddy's saying, we did it, Double Dee, everyone loves us, we're finally in, baby. And it only took 130 episodes, 4 specials, and a movie, Eddy. Let's sing a song. That's Ed. And they're singing that song, when you stub your toe and it hurts you, no friends are there to help you. So they're all friends. That's just fantastic. I really love it. It's an excellent, excellent series finale to an excellent show. Really well-written, well-crafted show. Really funny, really fun to watch. I really love this show. Great characters. So many funny slapstick moments, even in this movie too, a part where Eddy's like, I'm starting to hate slapstick. And great character growth from Eddy in this finale. It's just all fantastic. Really love it. And at the end with Johnny, and then he's like, movie? What movie? With him in his lair with Plank. So it's great. Just really love this show. Gotta love Ed and Eddy. Love it as much as Ed loves chickens. So with all that being said, I do have an Ed and Eddy story to share. It's called Edd the Stud. That's Ed with 2 D's, as in Double Dee. So here we go. Without further ado, it's story time. It was an ordinary day in the cul-de-sac. Kids were out and about, enjoying yet another lovely summer afternoon, while the Eds were busy concocting yet another one of their infamous scams. Hurry up, Double Dee, Eddy said, popping his head out of the top window of the 50-foot-high contraption they'd been building for the past few hours. It was a conglomeration of miscellaneous junkyard items, everything from scrap metal to plywood to a broken kitchen sink. It was meant to be an innovative flying device, part rocket ship, part airplane, and part catapult. An invention that likely would have made the Wright brothers weep for ruining the charm of early aviation, although Double Dee tried his best to ignore that glaring fact. Eddy claimed kids would cough up tons of quarters to ride the very first bouncy fly ship, and that was all that mattered to him. As for Double Dee, he was safely on the ground, holding up a homemade device to calculate the current wind speed. Patience is a virtue, Eddy, he said. Ed stuck his head out of the window directly below Eddy. I've got shoes, Eddy, he said happily. He said virtue, not shoes, you Nimrod, Eddy said, with a smack to Ed's head that sent it bouncing off the side of the heavy metal flying machine, only to clock Eddy in the face. Eddy reeled back with a yelp of pain, furiously rubbing his newly reddened cheek, while Ed simply erupted into a fit of giggles despite his contusion. Charming, Double Dee said dryly in regard to his friends, all the while jotting down some numbers based on his reading. Eddy's momentary bout of anger promptly snapped back into sheer eagerness as he rubbed his palms together and grinned. Boy, I can't wait to test this baby, he said. Just think, after we scam all the kids out of their money, we can sell this ship to NASA, and then we'll be so stinking rich we could buy every Jawbreaker joint in town. Can we also fly to the sun and try on hats? Ed asked. What are you, stupid? Eddy asked. The sun's like 200 miles away. Actually, the sun is approximately 93 million miles away from the Earth, Double Dee said. But seeing as how that's not the worst guess I've heard, I'd have to say that was a fairly reasonable conjecture on your part, Eddy. Blah, 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 enough yakking already, Eddy said impatiently. We ready to launch this thing or what? Double Dee turned a page of his notepad. Just a few more quick calculations and we'll be all ready to go. Ready to go? Ed asked in a rush of unrestrained excitement. Okie dokie, Double Dee. Ed, no, wait, Double Dee said, a frantic plea, but it was too late. Ed had ducked back inside and pressed a few buttons, cranking the machine to life. All at once there was the flickering of awaking electricity, the rapid sputtering of propellers, the shaking of metal objects, and finally an explosion of parts as Ed and Eddy shot skyward, Eddy's vicious scream tearing through the air, growing softer and softer the higher they went. And then silence. Having cowered back in utter fear for his own physical safety, Double Dee now peeked up at the sky. shakily releasing the protective grip he had on his hat. He stood up straight as he stared upward, absent-mindedly brushing some debris off his arms as he cast a fleeting glance at the completely destroyed ship. Now nothing but a mess of broken parts and billowing smoke. Well, despite some obvious engineering and constructional issues, the apparatus did manage to launch them to quite an impressive altitude, Double Dee said. Perhaps if I make an adjustment to the... A tap on his shoulder instantly quelled Double Dee's vocal musings. He swiveled around, only to see a smiling Johnny standing before him, clutching plank in one hand and a folded-up piece of paper in the other. "Oh, hello, Johnny," Double Dee said, a hand raised in friendly greeting. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "A little birdie wanted me to give you this," Johnny said, presenting Double Dee with the small piece of paper. "I see," Double Dee said as he accepted the note with tentative politeness. "May I ask the reason behind this request?" "Beats me," Johnny said with a shrug. "All I know is that I've been sworn to secrecy about who it's from, so don't bother asking because I'm not allowed to tell. Anyway, I guess I'll see you later." Johnny scurried off, leaving Double Dee by himself to ponder this strange new development. He looked over the seemingly ordinary piece of paper, folded in fours, a perfectly symmetrical square. "Odd," he said as he delicately unfolded it and began to read the message written on it. "I wonder who could have possibly—" His eyes suddenly popped open wide, as big and as round as tennis balls. A deep crimson blush swept over his face. He squeezed the sheet of paper with trembling fingers, staring at the words written to him in scrupulously neat handwriting, and a noticeably advanced vocabulary that matched his own. "Dear Ed, I'm writing you this letter to inform you that I've admired you for a formidably long period of time, but unfortunately I'm much too reticent to proclaim my feelings to you in person. Therefore, I've decided to express my emotions with written word in hopes that one day I'll be able to express them to you vocally. In the meantime, behind the safeguard of complete anonymity, I finally feel confident enough to tell you that, frankly, I think you're a stud. Cordially, your classified admirer." "Oh my," Double Dee said, his mind blasting into chaotic overdrive. He didn't even look up when Eddy's screaming voice grew louder, and his shadow on the ground grew wider, until Ed and Eddy crashed near Double Dee, who didn't so much as flinch. Eddy sat up, spitting out a mouthful of dirt and grass. He was covered in scuff marks, but otherwise miraculously unharmed. Ed chuckled all over again, even as Eddy growled and grabbed him by the shirt, shaking him forcibly. "Nice going, Ed. Now we gotta start over." He let go of Ed, who thunked back to the ground. "We flew higher than turtles in the desert." Eddy was already up and about, gathering up as many pieces of the charred remains of their ruined invention as he could. Yeah, make yourself useful for once and start rebuilding, would ya?" "Double Dee, go grab your measuring whatchamacallit." When he didn't hear anything, he stopped. "Double Dee?" Double Dee's eyes were still glued to the note, sweat trickling down his scarlet face. He didn't say a word. "Earth to Double Dee, what's with you?" "I think he forgot his name, Eddy," Ed said. "Yo, Double Dee, quit standing around and get to work," Eddy said. Still nothing. Frustrated, he dropped all the items he was holding and marched up to Double Dee, waving a hand in front of his face. "Hello, sockhead. Since when are you a space cadet like Monobrow over there?" The note flew out of Double Dee's hands as Ed popped up between the two of them and said, "I like fries with ketchup and relish." Double Dee immediately snapped out of his trance and shifted into panic mode as the piece of paper swayed lazily in the breeze and landed on Eddy's head. Before Double Dee could reach for it, Eddy snatched it off his head. "What the heck is this?" he asked, holding the note out at arm's length. "Eddy, please, I'm begging you, don't read that!" Once again, it was sadly too late. Eddy exploded into howling laughter, tears in his eyes and all. "Oh man, this is better than cable," he said, gasping for air. He looped an arm around Ed's head and pulled him in. "Hey, Lumpy, check it out. Double Dee's got a secret admirer." He waved the note in front of Ed's face, and Ed's mouth stretched into a grin as he took the paper and held it upside down. After a few seconds, he wolf whistled. "Boy, Double Dee, you're a real Cleopatra, huh?" "Casanova, Ed," Eddy said. "Thank you," Ed said. "Excuse me," Double Dee said, at last reclaiming the note with a simple tug out of Ed's hands. "Have the two of you truly lost all common decency that you can't even respect one's personal property?" "Aw, relax," Eddy said with a dismissive swipe of the hand. "Like we all don't know it was Ed's stupid sister who wrote you that mushy junk." "Actually," Double Dee said, "with all due respect to Sarah, I hardly believe she's managed to spontaneously acquire such an exceptionally vast vocabulary of which the author of this note clearly possesses. Oh yeah, lover boy? Eddy asked, smirking as though he were initiating a challenge. If that's the case, what do you say we go ask the obnoxious little brat ourselves just to be sure? What? Double Dee said, panic-stricken all over again. Oh no, Eddy, please, I'd really much rather prefer not to have to. Ed picked up the two of them, heaving them over his shoulders. The note slipped out of Double Dee's hands, but he quickly stretched his arms and caught it just as Ed took off and said, "Off to the next scene we go." Jimmy tossed a pebble on the ground, where a misshapen hopscotch board had been drawn out of colorful chalk by himself and Sarah. "Wish me luck, Sarah," Jimmy said after the pebble landed. "You can do it, Jimmy," Sarah said encouragingly. As soon as Jimmy hopped onto the first square, Ed barreled through, sending a squealing Jimmy flying into the empty cul-de-sac. "Come again," Ed said, setting down a steaming Eddy and a trembling Double Dee. Sarah growled with the ferociousness of a wolf as she shot a hand out towards her older brother, squeezing his face like a tube of toothpaste. "Ed, you big idiot! Look what you did to Jimmy!" She turned his head towards the empty street, where a garbled-up Jimmy managed to lift a hand. "I'm okay, Sarah," he said, waving meekly. Sarah glared at Ed, fire still in her eyes, while Ed grinned lopsidedly as she finally released him, and his head popped back into its normal shape. Ed picked up Double Dee, plopping him down in front of Sarah. "There you go, Double Dee," he said. Double Dee's eyes bulged. He stiffened, grinning apprehensively and yanking at his shirt collar. Sarah merely stared, hands on her hips and an impatient scowl on her face. "Yes, well, fine day we're having, isn't it?" Double Dee said as he backed away. "I should be going now." "Oh, for crying out loud," Eddy said as he yanked Double Dee back over and plucked the love note out of his hands, showing it to Sarah. "Did you write this crud or not?" Sarah smacked the note out of Eddy's hand and looked at it, her face contorting in confusion as she read it. At that point, Jimmy walked back up to her, rubbing his dented spine. With a shake of her head, Sarah slapped the note into Eddy's chest. "What is this, some kind of trick? You think I can understand all those big words?" "Big words scare me more than the inside of the upstairs linen closet," Ed said. Eddy glanced at the note, rubbing his chin, while Double Dee cleared his throat. "Allow me to take that back from you, thank you," he said, gently pulling the note out of his friend's hand and refolding it into a perfect square. He turned to Sarah and Jimmy. "On behalf of all three of us, I wish to issue the sincerest of apologies for disrupting your pleasant game of hopscotch. Have a nice day." With that, he walked away, and Eddy and Ed soon followed. After they were gone, Sarah grinned to herself, clasping her hands together and sighing dreamily. "That Double Dee really is a stud." "While I'm ordinarily never one to say 'I told you so,'" Double Dee said as he walked alongside his two best friends, "I feel as though it's the most fitting response I could think to express in this particular instance." Eddy wasn't paying him any attention as he kicked at the ground, hands stuffed in his pockets. "I just don't get it. How could someone have a crush on an egghead like you when a total hunk like me is standing right here?" "I hope you realize, Eddy, that it's precisely those types of remarks that chip away at my self-esteem." "I've got it!" Eddy said, startling Double Dee nearly half to death as he jumped and clutched a hand to his chest. "Goodness, Eddy, are you trying to give me heart palpitations? Because if so, you're succeeding. Pipe down already, will ya? I just figured out what the deal is with that letter. It's obviously a prank." "A prank?" Double Dee repeated, puzzled at first, but when he saw the pompous grin on Eddy's face, he couldn't help but cross his arms in indignation. "I see, because the idea of someone harboring any sort of romantic feelings for me is simply too far-fetched to believe. Is that it?" The grin dropped from Eddy's face. "Well, yeah. You certainly know how to destroy a person's confidence," Double Dee said. With a disappointed shake of his head, he walked away. "Fine, Mr. Hotshot, if you're so sure of yourself, who do you think wrote it?" Eddy asked, and he grinned wickedly. "Maybe Naz?" Double Dee froze mid-stride. He turned around, his face newly ignited in a bright shade of red. In a feeble attempt to compose himself, he straightened his posture. "Why, no, of course not," he said, wringing his hands madly, only to draw one to the back of his neck. "That hardly even occurred to me. Of course, even if it had, for argument's sake, been Naz who'd written such a meticulous and intimate message, I'd have no way of knowing for sure unless I got a sample of her handwriting and compared the two." "I'm on it, Double Dee," Ed said, popping out of the hollow opening of a tree bark, some leaves and twigs sitting atop his head. "Where the heck did you come from?" Eddy cut his question short with yet another loud yelp as he jumped, narrowly missing getting trampled on by Edd, who eagerly ran ahead and didn't stop. The two of them stared after him for a beat before Double Dee turns to Eddy. "Shall we?" "Like we got a choice," Eddy said. They broke into a sprint. Naz was hanging out with Rolf and Kevin, the latter proudly showing off his brand new leather jacket. He flexed his arms. "Go ahead, give it a feel," Kevin said, grinning slyly as he offered Naz his bicep. She giggled, extending her hand towards him. However, Rolf was the one who reached it first, running his palm up and down Kevin's arm. "Ah, yes, smoother than the hair above Nana's lip," he said. "Yeah, sure, whatever, dude," Kevin said, shaking him off. "How about you, Naz?" "Sure, Kev," she said, but she stopped when something else caught her attention. A friendly smile graced her face. "Hey, look, it's Edd." Kevin sharply turned his head, and sure enough, there stood Edd, an airheaded look on his face. "What do you want, Dorkenstein?" Edd wasted no time as he dug through his pants pocket and produced a chewed-up blue pen. He held it out to Naz and asked, "Can you teach me how to write?" By the time Double Dee and Eddy caught up to Edd, Double Dee was so out of breath he was quite literally gasping for air. Eddy skidded to a halt, leaving Double Dee to crash into him. He swiftly collapsed to the ground at a limp pile of skin and bones. "Curse my embarrassingly weak stamina," Double Dee said, wheezing, only to gasp again when Eddy grabbed him by his hat and held him up to look over the fence. "Look, Double Dee," Eddy said. Thanks to the lack of oxygen, however, Double Dee was momentarily too dizzy to look, made worse by Eddy dangling him by the hat, which he held onto for dear life. "I feel the need to warn you that I may regurgitate if you don't release me this very second." Eddy did, and Double Dee hit the ground. He got to his feet, and when he at last regained his equilibrium, he joined Eddy in looking over the fence. What he saw was Naz, her tongue sticking out of the corner of her mouth in concentration as she wrote something down, while Edd stood nearby. "We should have told him to charge her," Eddy said. "A nickel per word." "You really do have quite the one-track mind, don't you, Eddy?" Double Dee said. "What's that supposed to mean?" They looked at each other, and all it took was that 1 second of taking their eyes off of Edd for him to make a surprise entrance, this time by springing up behind them. "Hi, guys!" They both screamed. Double Dee clutched the fence, nails scraping the wood with how tightly he was holding it. "Please, Edd, I'm far too young to have a heart attack." "Here you go, Double Dee," Edd said, undeterred in his blind optimism as he handed Double Dee a new sheet of paper. "From Naz, hold the tomato." Double Dee examined the paper to see the alphabet written on it. He gave a pleased smile. "Why, thank you, Edd," he said as he took out the love note along with his magnifying glass. "You're a good friend." "I'm also a lump," Edd said. "You got that right," Eddy said, barking out a laugh. A clueless Edd joined in on the laughter, while Double Dee placed both sheets of paper on the ground. He held the magnifying glass to his eye, alternating between the two sheets. After doing this a few times, he frowned. "Oh dear, it appears the handwriting is clearly not a match," Double Dee said, and he sighed forlornly. "Perhaps you were right after all, Eddy. This anonymously written amorous note may very well be nothing more than a cruel practical joke on my own delicate expense." "Oh, big surprise," Eddy said. "See, I told ya." "Oh well, better luck next time, huh, Romeo?" Double Dee stuffed his magnifying glass back into his pocket and folded up the note once more. "It's unfortunate that Johnny can't reveal to me who wrote the letter, but I suppose it's only fair that I respect the person's privacy." "Hold on," Eddy said. "You're telling me Baldy has known all along who wrote the letter?" "As a matter of fact, he's the one who delivered it to me, but as I said, he asked me not to—" Eddy picked up Double Dee by the shoulders, jostling him. "You mean to tell me we could have saved precious time working on a scam instead of dealing with your stupid problem? Let's go find Johnny and put an end to this thing already." "But Eddy, as I've just informed you, he's been sworn to secrecy regarding who wrote the—" "Oh, please," Eddy said. "All it takes is a little smooth talking. Leave it to me, Double Dee." "Somehow your word doesn't instill much confidence in me, Eddy," Double Dee said, but Eddy was already off to find Johnny with the blissfully unaware Edd in tow. "You gotta put your weight into it, Plank," Johnny said, sitting on one end of the seesaw at the playground. He was planted on the ground, Plank on the other end, lying flat as a board on the suspended seat. "Hey there, Johnny boy," Eddy said as he walked up to him with Double Dee and Edd behind. "Seesaw, huh? Classic." He flashed his up-to-no-good smile, getting right down to it. "So, listen, about that note you gave Double Dee earlier." "Oh no, don't you even try, Eddy," Johnny said, wagging a finger. I've already told Double Dee I'm not allowed to tell. Sure, you're not allowed to tell him. But I doubt the person who wrote it mentioned anything about telling, say, me, right? Eddy asked. At that, Johnny paused, tapping his chin in contemplation with the hum, only to say, wait a minute, this isn't a trick, is it? Trick? Eddy said. No, don't be silly. How can anyone trick a smart guy like you? Think of it more like a loophole. Life's full of them. You just gotta know how to read between the lines. I don't know, Johnny said. Eddy, growing impatient with Johnny's reluctance to cough up the information he wanted, decided to switch tactics. Well, fine, if you won't blab, I'll just ask your good old buddy Plank instead, he said, smirking deviously. And if he refuses to tell, maybe he'd like to go for a quick ride on a wood chipper. No, Eddy, Johnny said pleadingly. Okay, I'll tell you. It was... Eddy, please, don't make me do this, Double Dee said, shoes scraping along the ground, leaving behind a long trail of dirt as Ed and Eddy pushed him forward, even as he resisted every step of the way. Have mercy on me, gentlemen, I beg of you. Oh, come on, Double Dee, Eddy said, cheeks red with the exertion from pushing him. You gotta quit being such a wuss and finally grow a pair. Pardon? Double Dee asked, unknowingly sliding up to the front door of the trailer. Ed pounded on the door with his fist. Knock, knock, who's there? He said, and immediately ducked behind a nearby trailer with Eddy. A cacophony of giggles rang out from inside the trailer where Double Dee stood. His eyes widened and his body shook as he broke into a sweat. Who's at the door? Lee asked. Answer it, Marie, May said. You answer it, Marie said. I'm busy. There were some random crashes and other noises. When the door opened, May timidly peeked out, before opening it all the way. Double Dee, she said, bewildered. May, Double Dee said in the same tone. A strange silence passed between them, one that felt strangely familiar, but before either one of them could break it, May's sisters joined her at the front door. Well, what do we have here? Lee asked, an intimidating smirk slithering across her face. Christmas must have come early this year, huh, girls? Where's the rest of 'em? Who cares? Marie asked. She stepped right in front of Double Dee, invading his personal space and grinning at him just as terrifyingly. What can we do for you, good-looking? Well, you see, I received this mysterious note today, and... Let me see, Lee said, slapping it out of his hand. All three Canker sisters read the note, brows furrowed, and Lee was the first to laugh. Classified admirer, what a show-off. Whoever wrote this stuff has got themselves a good dictionary. Wait, Double Dee said. Are you insinuating you're all seeing this note for the first time? What do you think, stud? Marie asked, letting out a cackle as she looped an arm around him. No, wait, please, He shrieked helplessly as they pulled him inside for his inevitable doom. Well, this is certainly familiar, Double Dee said, covered in kiss marks. He attempted to rub them off with a handkerchief as he walked with Ed and Eddy on either side of him. One would think the feeling of overwhelming shame would lessen after each tyrannical act of the Canker sisters' unwanted physical affection, but ironically, it only seems to worsen with each occurrence. But Double Dee, don't you have a crush on... Double Dee had pressed his palm against Ed's mouth. Eddy stared at them skeptically, eyebrow raised, while Double Dee's nervous chuckle stopped. Ed, dare I ask why your mouth feels so greasy? He asked, removing his hand and vigorously wiping it with the handkerchief. Too much gravy, Double Dee, Ed said. It just doesn't make any sense, Eddy said. If the Cankers didn't write you that dumb note, who did? You know, Eddy, as perplexed as I am about that very query, I've realized it's probably best we cease our persistence in trying to find out the answer, and instead respect the writer's anonymity, regardless of whether it was nothing more than a mere heartless prank. Besides, I think I've endured quite enough mortification for one day, don't you? So what, after all that, we don't even get to find out who wrote the stupid thing? Eddy asked. What a cop-out. I like to think of it more as an open-ended resolution, Double Dee said. Perhaps one day we'll learn who... give it a rest, won't ya? Eddy said. I'm bored now. Let's go to my place and watch TV. I love regularly scheduled programming, Eddy, Ed said, wrapping his arms around each of his friends and leading the way to Eddy's house. Boy, Plank, you're lucky I covered for you, Johnny said, walking home. I just hope you've learned your lesson, mister. This is what happens when you let a prank go too far. And all because Double Dee corrected your grammar? You really are diabolical. Alright, that was Edd the Stud. So I wonder if it was obvious that it was plank all along, or if hopefully had you going there for a second. But that was my attempt of writing a story crafted in the structure of an actual Edd and Eddy episode. So I hope you enjoyed that. And I love chickens, Eddy. And with that, that's going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. You can follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Storytelling Saga, as well as on Twitter at Storytell Saga. You can also send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by leaving me a message in the contact section of storytellingsaga.com or by sending me an email at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next week, I will be discussing story endings and just the key to writing endings for stories. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.